Hello everyone. So in the last video, we talked about the first part of Parmenides' poem, fragment 8, that is, not the first part of the poem, but the first part of fragment 8, where he talks about the impossibility of generation, of coming into being, of perishing, of, in fact, the impossibility of time, of thinking about past and future, the meaninglessness of the terms past and future, and the concept of eternality, and the idea that being is either fully is or is not, and if it fully is, it is eternally present, and that means that there can be no past or future for it. So that's what we talked about in the last video, which was really the first deduction in the first 21 lines of the poem, where, well, from line sort of 6 to 21 of this fragment, where he talks about this ageneton, this not being born, and anolethron, which is, imperishability of this esti. Then in this video, we'll talk about the rest of the deductions. So there are 3 more, where he talks about it being a hulon monogenes, which basically means whole and unique, whole and one of its kind. Then he talks about atremes, which is basically motionless, it doesn't have any motion. And he talks about synikes, which is continuous. I mean, one of the translations could be it has things together, syn, right? So the idea of continuity, of being clinging on to being, let's say, in that sense, right? So these are the 3 parts that we'll discuss. So as I said, already in the last sort of deduction, you could have figured out that being, that is what is unique. It's one, because it either fully is or is not. And if it fully is, esti, fully is, then it has not been generated from anything else. It cannot be generated from anything else, and that means that there are no 2 beings, right? So this unique derivation is actually not very difficult, because given all that, it has to be just one being. It cannot have, there cannot be 2 beings in there. And the derivation of continuity and indivisibility will also be pretty sort of clear once we get through it. But let's sort of read out a bit more of the poem. So we were at line 21, right? Yeah. So he says, nor is it divided, since it is all alike, and it is not any more there which would keep it from holding together, nor any worse, but it is all replete with what is, right? So the idea that it is not divisible, there's no divisibility to being, because it all equally is. It equally is, on both sides. Also that he says it cannot exist more fully in one direction, because if it held more fully in one direction, let's say it, what's the translation out here? He says, nor is it any more there which would keep it from holding together. If it was more in one direction and less in another direction, let's say if there was more and less of being, then it would not hold, right? So it can't be more in one direction and less in another, right? And it is always full. This is this plenitude, of being. There's this fullness to being. And this fullness makes it continuous, right? So he derives from that. He says it is all continuous because what is clings on to what is. We've already looked at that. It is close to what is. I know I said I would not read more of my translation, but maybe I will go back to it because, I did spend some time on it. So, my translation is, nor is it divided, since it is all alike, right? Which means it exists everywhere altogether. Nor is something exceedingly in one direction, in one respect, let's say, which would prevent it from being held together. Nor is it something lesser in another way, exceedingly in one way and lesser in another way, but all is full of being, always full of being, right? And with which then everything is united, it exists all together, it exists homogeneously, in fact, because if it is not more in one and less in one, then it is homogeneous. So it exists homogeneously, and why? Because being sort of approaches being, that's the word he uses, I think, peladze, the idea of being approaching being close to being. There's this idea of being sort of, there is always one being, and that being is a single being, which is continuous. Yeah. Then the next deduction, which is for atrepes, which is motionless, for motionlessness, he says, but unmoved, it exists, but unmoved in the limit of great bonds. There are these great bonds that hold it. Why do they hold it? Because we already saw it cannot be more in one direction. Necessity holds it, really. Logic holds it, because it cannot be divided. It cannot be in two parts. It cannot be in multiple parts, because then how is this being distinguished from that being? Remember, so it is unique in that sense. It cannot be more in one direction and less in another direction. So it is homogeneous and continuous, right? It's all of these things, and it's always sort of at the same place. It's clinging on to being, but the idea is that there are no two beings in the first place. So there's a continuity, there's a homogeneity to being, right? So those are the great bonds that he's talking about. It unmoved in that. It exists. It is. Again, esti is the word that is used, without beginning and without ceasing, right? An archon, it doesn't have an arche, right? It doesn't have a beginning. And apauston, it doesn't have a stopping, it doesn't have a ceasing, it doesn't pause, it doesn't stop. So it doesn't have an arche, it doesn't have a beginning, it doesn't have an end. So it is without beginning, without end, because he says, since coming to be and destruction, the genesis and olethros, the coming to be, being, and the becoming and destruction are both not, So he says, since coming to be and destruction have been driven very far away, and trustworthy truth has thrust it away. Sorry, my translation, I always end up using a bit of anyway. So trustworthy truth has thrust it away. Let me see what the other translation is. Yeah. This is line 28, right? Since generation and destruction have wandered quite far away, and genuine conviction has expelled them. Okay, yeah, genuine conviction has expelled them is a bit more prosaic, I feel. So genuine conviction, trustworthy truth, as I call it, have expelled them, has thrust it away. Yeah. So remaining the same, in the same place. So as you can see, there is no. Why is there no movement? Because remaining the same in the same place, it lies by itself. In this way, it remains here constantly. It's in the same place. It remains the same, and it remains there constantly. So why would it move? For mighty necessity, and here necessity, ananke with capital A, alpha, comes in. Ananke, necessity, another goddess. So we have lots of goddesses here. Ananke holds it limited in bonds, holds it limited with these bonds. There are all these bonds and fetters of decay, Ananke, gates and locks. So you can see, there's this necessity to logic, really. That's what he's bringing forward out here. Which shuts it in from all round, which controls it. It shuts it in, so it cannot move, it cannot sort of go one place to another. Why? Because it is necessary that it is, it cannot be more and less, it cannot be here and there, it has to be in one place, unmoving, by necessity, really. Wherefore, it is not right that being is without end, for it is not lacking, but by being, it would lack everything. By not being, I suppose, it would lack everything. As I said, that's why, I like my translation because I feel closer to it, but I've not sort of revised it entirely. So, the other one says, wherefore it is right that what is be not unfulfilled, for it is not lacking. If it were, it would lack everything. Yeah. So it is not lacking, I suppose. So the idea that in this fragment, to continue from our discussion, it is continuous and indivisible. Why? Because it cannot exist more in one direction and less in another direction. It is continuous. It holds together to where it is. And if you remember fragment 4, where we had this idea of things distant being present to the mind immediately. Let me just find it again. He says, look nevertheless at things absent, securely present in the mind, for you will not cut off what is from clinging to what is, neither scattering on every side altogether, nor combining in, one. So you have this idea that the mind, like in fragment 4, the mind can make far off things present to you immediately. Unlike the senses, which are omnipresent and scattered, your senses are scattered all over the place, but for senses for which things are not omnipresent, things are, some are here and some are not there, but for the mind, things are omnipresent, in fact, our mind is capable of having everything present for us immediately. It's sort of like the Xenophanes' God that we talked about earlier, right? And being can never sort of be separated from from reality, from itself. And not being separated from itself, it becomes a single, unique, whole, continuous, homogeneous sort of entity, right? So the things that the deduction 2 was trying to derive was, it becomes a single, continuous, whole, homogeneous, sort of unique being, right? So in that sense, he would say that there are no greater or lesser degrees of being, right? There's an undifferentiated continuum. Yeah, the being is an undifferentiated continuum, and this continuum is, and we'll get to that, it'll become a sphere, a circle. It becomes a kind of like a round ball, he'll say, right? Why? Because for what is must either fully be or not be, right? And it is impossible for not being to be, yeah? I mean, I know it sounds like a broken record, but it's really important that you grasp it. So in that sense, what is indivisible, continuous, and there's no such thing as a gap, there's no void, there's a fullness of being, as I said, there's a plenity of being. And then there's bonds that he talks about in the latter half of what we just read out, where he says, that what is being is motionless, and it lies within its limits. It lies within its perata, the peras. It lies within that. It's not aperon. So it is, again, as we said, earlier as well, there was something opposing Anaximander out here. Again, there's an opposition to Anaximander. We can say that there is no aperon. Being lies within these bonds. There are all these bonds that keep coming in, by the way, of the first goddess, then of Dike, then of Ananke. The constant bonds that are holding being within its limits. There are these rules and laws and perata which hold it. So it unmoved, as he says, in the grip of these big bonds, of these mighty bonds. It exists sort of, without beginning, without ceasing, without perishing, without being born. And, as I said, my translation, which was that a trustworthy truth has thrust it away, right? So in that sense, the true conviction in the other translation has expelled it, has rejected it, and for that reason, it remains firmly where it is, right? And that's the bond, that necessity that Ananke says, no, you cannot exceed these bonds. You have to stay in here. The Heraclitus, the sun does not exceed its limits. Here, being does not exceed its limits. Right? There's this thing of these bonds as this chain that holds it from all around, like these perata. And that's why it remains unmoved, it stays in the same place. There's this complete immobility of the real for Parmenides, which is just the opposite of Heraclitus. I know I keep mentioning Heraclitus, but think about it. It's the opposite in that sense, that it remains the same, it does not change, it is immobile entirely, and it is a total single continuous plenum, really. And if all that is, if being is a single continuous plenum, then there is nowhere for it to move. There is no void for it to move. Like the idea was, at least for the ancients, the idea was that for things to move, they would have to move into some empty space. In fact, there were two ideas of motion. There was one idea that there'd be an exchange of places, but then for that, being will have to be divisible, or there was a void outside which it could move into, but it cannot, right? Because what is entirely, and what is not, right? So there's nowhere for it to move. and nor does it, as I said, have parts that can change places. So it is not divisible. Remember, it is indivisible, so it cannot change places internally. So there's no internal movement in being. There's no external movement of being, right? So that means that there's an impossibility of kinesis, of movement, of change. This kinesis, from which you get the word kinetic, for example, right? So there is an impossibility of any kind of movement internally or externally for this being, yeah? And in that sense, it is hemmed in by necessity, this ananke that holds it. So she holds it in these bonds of basically impossibility, and which is why the last section that we read, where it was about lacking, it says that, wherefore it is not right that being is without end, for it is not lacking, because by lacking, if it lacked something, then it would lack everything. If you think of it, as it is not allowed, in other words, for it to be incomplete, right? To be lacking in any way. It is a complete system. Being is complete. Because if it would lack, if there was anything lacking, then it would lack everything, is what Parmenides is saying. So what does that mean? Basically, it is a criticism of the idea of being as apeiron, right? Because if being was apeiron, then it would be unfinished. If it is unfinished and incomplete, then it is not a perfect whole, right? And then there would be something that it is not, yeah? But as he said, if what is, then it cannot be incomplete, right? Because then, to some extent, the incompletion is what is not, right? So it must either fully be or not be, as we saw in the earlier line. So if it is lacking, then it is not entirely, right? It's a very binary system where you either are 1 or 0. Like really, it's like a binary code. You either are 1 plenum, one single thing, or you're not. Yeah, you cannot be like slightly less than 1. 1 which is not complete. There's a limit to 1. In fact, think of it as the number, the number 1 completes that limit. It's the cardinality of 1. The 1 has the cardinality of 1, and that's how it is the ordinal 1. The ordinal 1 is a complete number in that sense. So Parmenides, let's say, thinks in whole natural numbers, while Heraclitus thinks in incomplete numbers, with going somewhere infinite numbers, but without having reached the limit of that whole set. So basically, then he continues the last few lines, which is a kind of a recapitulation that he does, some summary of the thing, in which he says, thinking and on account of which there is thought are the same, for without being, in which it is said or has been said, you will not find thought, right? So idea that what can be thought and the thought that it is, the same thing that we talked about in the other fragment, fragment 6, are the same, yeah? Thinking and, there are different translations for this. One translation could be the same thing as thinking and the thought that it exists. One translation could be thinking and on account of which there is thought is the same. Translation of poems is a bit difficult anyway. So why? Because he says, for without that which is, in which it is expressed, you will not find thought, right? You will not find thought without that. Nothing exists or can exist apart from what is, since, you will not find, without being, in which it is said, you will not find thought, for nothing either is or will be except being, right? So without being, you will not find thought. Except being, there nothing either is or will be. Since fate, and here you have Moira coming back, yeah, Moira or fate has at least has fettered it to be whole and unmoving, yeah. So there are again these perata, these limits, which has made it whole, unmoving. By it, all that is named, as many as mortals have established, trusting to be true, which is becoming and perishing, to be and not to be, being and non-being, and to change place and exchange bright color. I think that's the translation. I'll read another translation for you actually. So he says, nothing exists or can exist apart from what is, since fate has fettered it so as to be whole and unmoved. Therefore, all things must be a name which mortals have agreed upon believing them to be real, coming into being and perishing, being and not being, change of place and alteration of bright color. Right? So all these things are, these are just names, in fact. They're empty names without any content to them. Because being does not come into be, does not perish, And this is going one sort of step further from like the speaking, what can be thought and spoken is. Here, you can speak of it, but you're speaking just empty words. These are words of mortals, which don't make sense because these are palinthropos. You're confusing being and non-being, and you're sometimes giving content of non-being to being, right? So basically what he's saying is, in summary, we don't know, like this is one of the interpretations, is that the words like coming to be, change, motion, alteration, division, are all these things are just names, names that mortals have come up with, and names without any content. These are just words without meaning, words without thought, really. And all thought really has to have a real object, which is by this first line where he says, thinking on account of it and on account of which there is thought are the same. Or rather, another translation would be what can be thought and the thought that it is are the same. Right? The same thing is thinking and the thought that it exists. So all thought must have a real object. One cannot know something in the mind without an apprehension of its existence. Thought depends on what is. And what is, as he has demonstrated in this sort of theorem, is unique, whole, unmoved, changeless, all of these things. Therefore, he would say that coming into being, perishing, movement, these are all unreal things, just names, right? Unreal things. They're mere words, as he says. They're just sort of mere words. And this is what the goddess in the very beginning of the poem was telling him, don't go down that path, because that's a path of confused mortals who have this wandering eye and ringing ear and then just come up with random nonsense. These are nonsensical words, really, because they have no content to them. They're contentless, impossible words. So he says, although it is impossible to think or to utter that which is not, what he's saying is that the wandering mind, the erring faculties of mortals, of human beings, the eye, the ear, all of these senses, we are able to coin names. We have this nominalist tendency. We can coin names which do not correspond to any reality. Yeah, these are empty names, mere words, and we are literally saying nothing, which is not. Yeah, utterly meaningless words. So we should really not do that, basically. Yeah. Now the last deduction, which is the deduction of synechis, which is continuity, right? Holding together, having together. So I'll try and read this out as well first from mine, where he says. But since the utmost limit has been reached, or rather since there is an utmost limit, it has been reached, right? If you have an utmost limit, it is completed. That's how you know it is utmost, right? Otherwise, you would not know that it is utmost. From every side, resembling a mass of well-rounded sphere, from the center, it is evenly balanced, for it need be neither something greater in one place nor something smaller in another place, right? So it is this kind of a mass of well-rounded sphere which is evenly balanced, and for it is neither not being, which will stop it from coming to its like, nor is it being in such a way that it could be more than being in one place and less in another, since it is inviolate everywhere. For from all sides being the same, it meets in the same limits. So yeah, sorry, I read it out very, very fast, but let's just sort of, see where he's going with this. So basically, he's saying that as there is a furthest limit, as I said, it is complete from every side. So you have a furthest limit, it's complete from every side. And if it is complete from every side, then it is equal to every side. And anything that is equal to all sides will be well-rounded, will be like a sphere. Because it will have to be equally balanced from the center. So it has being, in that sense, is spherical. And that's his proof for sphericity, is that it is equal in every way from the center. And it cannot be greater in one direction and smaller in another direction. That's a recapitulation of what he said before. Because it is, he says, for neither is there what is not, which might stop it from reaching its limit. So it doesn't appear, there are no gaps in the middle of being. So it will never sort of, it would be evenly balanced. It would not stop it from reaching its like, he says. Nor is it possible that what is should be here more and here less than what is, since all is there. It is all there in equal on all sides, and it meets its limits uniformly on all sides, right? So basically, repetition of early ideas, but he's also saying that there are no intervals of non-being. There are no intervals of non-being into separate portions of, one portion here, one portion there. Being is homogeneous, and it cannot be greater or smaller. It cannot be less or more, and that makes it spherical, right? Being becomes spherical because it is equal in all directions from the center. And is this idea of sphericity, I mean, think about it, it's a mathematical sphericity, right? It is derived from a mathematical notion, not from any kind of physical observation. Basically, he's saying that he's not referring to the earth. So, I mean, one of the understandings, one of the interpretations could be that it is figurative sphericity rather than literal, right? But and also because it's not a body. If you think about this being, this ST with all these characteristics, it is immutable, timeless, changeless, not formless, motionless, unique, homogeneous, indivisible. Then how is it all this and yet a body filling space? Because if it fills space, then there is some part of it which is space and some part of which it is not, right? So it is a mathematical, logical sort of use of the term sphere, I think. He's not talking about the earth, right? He's talking about, because think about it, even space has been abolished, because if there was space, then the being would be in that space, yeah? I mean, the place of being would be in space, but then space would be separate from being. But then what is not being is not. Yeah, so there is no space. So space has been abolished. In fact, we have abolished space, we have abolished time. So the idea of sphericity cannot be a sphere hanging out in space somewhere. Even if we think of it as Anaximander's Earth, which was cylindrical, actually not spherical, but it was in a spherical universe. Why? Because remember, Anaximander said that it cannot be more in one direction and less in another direction. Similar argument to this one, where he says that why should it be more in one another? And that's why it hangs in the middle of the world, as it is suspended in the middle of the universe, Earth. Right? That was Anaximander's idea. Well, here you have a similar idea of sphericity. But this sphericity is plenum. There is no gap, yeah? And that means that there is no outside of the sphere either. There is no outside, in fact. Il n'y a pas dehors text, right? There is no outside of being for Parmenides. And so it is a, when we talk about the sphere, the spherical, it is a kind of metaphor, I would say, for uniformity, or a mathematical notion of equality in all directions, of homogeneity, really. It's a metaphor for homogeneity. So in that sense, and also because he says that it is complete, right? The furthest limit has been reached, so it is complete. So spatially, in that sense, it is within limits, but there is no outside of the limit, right? You can think of it topologically as being contained in that same space. It's a kind of not a Borromean knot, but a topological space of like a single, like the surface will turn back into itself. So in that sense, it's a sphere, the full sort of sphere of being. So, I mean, you could think of it, or if you want to go rather from maths to physics, you can think of it as Einstein's curved space, if you want to, apply, really anachronistic notions to this. so a curved finite space rather than an infinite flat space. It's a curved finite space, right? So, but he's not really talking about a physical manifestation of the sphere, but rather of the topological or geometrical sphere, which is the object of thought for Parmenides. Yeah. So this is what we have, and in fact, we have more lines. So yeah, when I remembered 61 lines, it was because I had like also translated the last bit, which was a way of appearance, where he says, at this point, I seize for you the trustworthy account. In fact, the way of appearance, let's do it in the next video because this video has become long enough. But yeah, he'll seize this trustworthy account and mediation regarding true reality. From this point on, mortal notions learn, this is what the goddess is saying, listening to the deceptive order of my verses, right? So we'll do a very short video where we'll talk about the way of appearance because, as I said, we anyway don't have much of that poem. But this was the trustworthy way of being, the way of truth. Whether you're persuaded or not, I don't know, because it's complicated logical argument, but it is a very strong argument, I would still say, in favor of logic, and it has had like a very, very strong influence really on Plato, and through Plato with, you know, us all being footnotes in the history of philosophy, as somebody said. So you know, like Plato, footnotes to Plato. So the history of Western philosophy really is, that's why when in the first video when I said like dynamite, you know, it's a kind of dynamite that he's putting forth. And in fact, we'll see already with the pre-Socratics, we'll see with Empedocles and Anaxagoras, you know, the kind of dynamite that he is, you know, because now they have to answer him. They feel like once he has posed this challenge that there's no movement, there's no change, there's no cosmos, all your science, all your cosmology, everything is completely nonsensical. There's just one single unique being that doesn't change, right? So now they all feel like they have to answer this challenge. And so, you know, later philosophy, which I would say culminates in this, in the atomism of Democritus, is answering to this challenge of how can there be change with this challenge posed by Parmenides. And Zeno will cover next week, where we'll talk about his defense of Parmenides and the paradoxes that he comes up with, which are very cool. All right, thanks. I'll do a short video on the way of appearance next, which will be a kind of digression aside if you think of it that way. And yeah, thank you a lot. Thank you. Thanks a lot.